hidden relics from the period are still being discovered as historians decipher old military documents.
For decades, the maps of Iwo Jima were treated as complete, but a team of modern explorers just found something that changes the entire history of the Pacific. They went back into the tunnels everyone said were empty and found a massive underground headquarters that was never touched. It's not that simple though, because the deeper they went, the more they realized the island was still holding on to its secrets. What most people do not realize is that the real story of this place happened in the dark, and now those secrets are finally coming into the light for everyone to see. The nightmare reopened after 80 years. The researchers used special ground-penetrating radar and thermal imaging to look beneath the surface. What they found was not just a few caves or a couple of holes in the ground. They found a massive, interconnected fortress that stretched for miles and miles. Imagine a subterranean world with 5 different levels, all stacked on top of each other. The crazy part is that this was all built by hand using simple tools and a lot of sweat. Most people do not realize that the island is basically hollow. It is like a giant ant farm made of volcanic rock and ash. And get this, the researchers found that some of these tunnels were so deep that they were nearly 100 feet below the surface. This was not just a place to hide, it was a place to live and fight for months without ever seeing the sun. The tunnels connected everything. There were giant rooms for storage, smaller rooms for sleeping, and even places that were set up like small hospitals. The researchers found evidence that thousands of people were moving through these passages at the same time, all while the world above was being turned into a wasteland. It is not that simple though, because the conditions down there were absolutely brutal. The volcano is not exactly dormant and the ground is still very hot. In some of the deeper sections, the temperature can reach over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Can you imagine trying to work or sleep in heat like that? On top of the heat, the air was filled with the smell of sulfur, which makes it hard to breathe. It was like living inside the throat of a dragon. The researchers were shocked to find that much of this network is still in great shape. Even after 80 years, the walls are solid and the passages are clear. They found old boots, rusted equipment, and even some personal letters that had been sitting in the dark for decades. It felt like stepping into a time machine. The thing is, many of these areas were sealed off after the fighting ended, and they were forgotten for a long time. People assumed the tunnels had collapsed or been filled in. Yeah, about that, the researchers found that the engineering was so good that the tunnels actually survived things that would have leveled a normal building. This was a masterpiece of defensive design that the world is only just now starting to appreciate. The scale of the project is what really gets people. Originally, the plan was to build nearly 18 miles of tunnels. By the time the researchers did their work, they confirmed that at least 11 miles were finished. That is a huge distance for such a tiny island. If you laid those tunnels out in a straight line, they would stretch across the entire island and then some. And these were not just straight lines, they were a maze designed to confuse anyone who tried to enter. There were hidden exits, false turns, and traps everywhere. It was a giant puzzle made of stone and ash. The more the researchers explored, the more they realized how much the experts had underestimated the system. They found command centers that were 50 meters long and 20 meters wide. These were huge spaces equipped with radios and mapping tables. It was like a hidden underground government. They also found massive bunkers that were reinforced with concrete and steel. These places were built to survive the heaviest hits from above. What most people do not realize is that the people inside these bunkers were often safer than anyone on the surface. They were tucked away in the heart of the island, watching and waiting. But even with all this technology, the mystery of how they built it all remains one of the most interesting parts. How did they move all that rock? Where did they put the dirt they dug out? How did they keep the air moving so people could breathe? These are the questions that the researchers are still trying to answer today. Every time they think they have the full picture, they find another hidden shaft or a secret room that was not on any map. It is a story that keeps growing the deeper they go. The dark passages are finally giving up their secrets, but the most shocking part is yet to come. The impossible fortress carved in fire. Building this massive underground world was an absolute nightmare, and that is putting it lightly. When the commander of the island arrived, he realized that a normal defense would not work. He knew that the island was going to be attacked by a much larger force, and he had to figure out a way to make it last as long as possible. So he looked at the volcano and the soft rock and had a wild idea. He decided to turn the entire island into a fortress that nobody could see. This was the birth of the tunnel project, and it was a task that seemed impossible from the start. To make this happen, he used nearly 5,000 workers who did nothing but dig. For months, they worked 24 hours a day in shifts. They did not have big machines or fancy equipment. They had picks, shovels, and their own hands. The crazy part is that they had to do most of the work at night or very quietly so that they would not be spotted from the air. They were carving through volcanic ash and porous rock, which is easier to dig than solid granite, but it has its own problems. The rock was prone to collapsing, so they had to use wooden beams and concrete to keep the ceilings from falling on their heads. The heat was the biggest enemy, hands down. Because the island is volcanic, the ground is naturally hot. The deeper they dug, the hotter it got. Imagine digging a hole while the air around you is over 100 degrees and smells like rotten eggs because of the sulfur. The workers had to wear masks just to keep from passing out. There was no fresh water on the island either, so they had to ration every drop. They were thirsty, tired, and living in a permanent state of darkness. But they kept digging because they knew their lives depended on it. They created a world that was meant to be invisible from the sky. Everything was planned out with extreme detail. They didn't just dig random holes, they built specific rooms for specific things. There were ammunition dumps where they could keep thousands of rounds of explosives safe from the bombs falling above. There were communication centers with wires running through the walls to keep everyone connected, and get this, they even built underground kitchens and medical clinics. They were trying to create a self-sustaining city that could survive for months without any help from the outside world. They even had fuel storage for 500 drums of oil buried deep underground. One of the most impressive parts was the way they handled the artillery. They didn't just leave their big guns out in the open. Instead, they carved out huge rooms inside the cliffs and the volcano itself. They would roll the guns out to fire and then pull them back inside the mountain where they couldn't be hit. It was like a giant game of hide and seek, but with massive cannons. The researchers found one bunker called the Nan Po bunker that was buried 90 feet underground. It was so deep and so well built that it was basically a city of its own. It had its own power generators and water storage. The tunnels also served as a way to move people around without being seen. If a certain part of the island was under attack, they could send hundreds of soldiers through the tunnels to reinforce that spot in minutes. The people on the surface would have no idea where they were coming from. It was like they were fighting ghosts that could pop up anywhere at any time. This strategy changed everything. It turned a tiny island into a defensive monster that was almost impossible to conquer. What is really wild is that they even used the natural caves that were already there. Mount Suribachi, the big volcano, had over 1,000 yards of tunnels inside of it. They used the high vantage points to look out over the beaches and see everything that was happening. They were like birds of prey watching from inside the rock. The level of planning was so intense that they even booby-trapped the entrances to the tunnels. If anyone tried to get in, they would run into a nasty surprise. It was a fortress designed to be a one-way trip for anyone who dared to enter. But as the pressure from the outside world grew, the life inside the tunnels became even more desperate. They were running low on food and water, and the air was getting harder to breathe. Yet, they stayed. They stayed because the tunnels gave them a sense of security that the surface could never provide. They were the masters of the underground, and they were determined to hold on to their hidden world until the very end. The researchers found that some of these rooms were used for months on end, with people barely ever leaving the dark. The construction of this fortress was a feat of human will that is hard to even wrap your head around. It was a mix of brilliant engineering and pure desperation. The researchers are still amazed by how they managed to keep everything from collapsing under the weight of the massive bombs that were being dropped on the island. The tunnels held firm, even when the ground above was being ripped apart. It was a testament to the strength of the design and the hard work of the people who built it. Even as the fortress was completed, a new and much more dangerous phase of the story was about to begin. The invisible army that wouldn't quit. When the massive force of 70,000 Marines finally landed on the black sand of Iwo Jima, they expected a quick fight. They thought a few days of intense action would be enough to take the island, but they were in for a rude awakening. For the first few hours, the island was eerily quiet. There was almost no resistance. The Marines moved inland, thinking they had it easy. But that was exactly what the defenders wanted. They were waiting in the tunnels, watching through tiny slits in the rock. And then, all at once, the island exploded with fire. The tunnels allowed the defenders to stay safe while the initial bombardment was happening. Thousands of shells had been dropped on the island, but most of them just hit the surface and did nothing to the people underground. When the Marines moved in, the defenders emerged from their hidden holes and started the fight. The crazy part is that a Marine could clear a bunker with a flamethrower, move on, and then 5 minutes later, more defenders would pop out of the same bunker. How? Because they were using the tunnels to move back into the positions from other parts of the island. It was like fighting an army that could teleport. The fighting was some of the most intense in history. There were places like the Meat Grinder and Bloody Gorge where the landscape was just a maze of rocks and hidden holes. The Marines had to fight for every single inch of ground. They had to use flamethrowers and explosives to seal up the tunnel entrances one by one. But there were so many entrances that it was like trying to stop a leak in a dam with your fingers. For every tunnel they closed, 3 more seemed to open up somewhere else. The defenders were following a strict set of orders. Stay in the tunnels and take out as many people as possible before you are neutralized. The conditions for the people in the tunnels were getting worse by the day. The heat was still there, but now they were also dealing with smoke and the smell of explosives. Many of them were wounded but had nowhere to go. The underground hospitals were full and supplies were running out. They were eating tiny portions of rice and drinking whatever water they could find, dripping from the ceiling. But here is the deal. They did not give up. They stayed in the dark, moving through the narrow passages, waiting for their moment to strike. It was a war of shadows. The Marines eventually brought in special tanks that could shoot fire into the caves. These were called Zippo tanks, and they were terrifying. They would spray a stream of burning liquid deep into the tunnels, which would consume all the oxygen and make it impossible to survive. But even this did not stop everyone. Some of the tunnels were so deep and had so many turns that the fire could not reach the very back. The defenders would just retreat further into the earth and wait for the tanks to pass. It was a brutal cycle of hide and seek that lasted for weeks. One of the most famous parts of the battle was the taking of Mount Suribachi. When the flag was raised on top of the mountain, most people thought the battle was over. But they were wrong. The mountain was still full of tunnels, and there were hundreds of people still inside. The fighting continued underground for a long time after the flag was flying on top. The researchers found that the tunnels inside the volcano were actually some of the most complex, with multiple exits that allowed people to sneak out at night and cause trouble behind the lines. The scale of the loss was massive. Out of more than 21,000 defenders, only about 200 were captured during the main part of the battle. Almost everyone else stayed in the tunnels until the very end. It was a level of commitment that is hard to understand. They saw the tunnels as their final home, and they were willing to stay there no matter what. The Marines lost nearly 7,000 people, which was a huge price to pay for such a small island. The tunnels had done exactly what they were designed to do. They made the cost of victory incredibly high. The battle officially ended after 36 days, but the story of the tunnels was far from over. Even as the ship sailed away and the island was declared secure, there was a secret still lingering in the dark. There were people left behind who had no intention of coming out. They were the ghosts of the tunnels, and they were about to prove that the war was not over for everyone. The war above ground was over, but the shadows were still very much alive. Ghosts that outlived the war. When the main battle ended and the island was declared safe, most of the world turned its attention to other things. But on Iwo Jima, a strange and quiet war was still happening. It is estimated that nearly 3,000 people were still hiding in the tunnels when the official fighting stopped. These were the holdouts, people who either did not know the war was ending or refused to believe it. They stayed in the deep, dark corners of the island, living like ghosts. They would only come out at night to look for food and water, sneaking around the American camps like shadows. The soldiers who stayed on the island to clean things up were called the cavemen. Their job was to go from hole to hole and make sure nobody was left. It was a dangerous and spooky job. They would find signs of life everywhere, fresh footprints in the ash, empty food cans, and small fires that had just been put out. The holdouts were experts at staying hidden. They had lived in those tunnels for so long that they knew every turn and every secret exit. They could move across the island without ever being seen on the surface. The life of a holdout was incredibly tough. They were living on almost nothing. They would find old crates of food that had been buried months ago, and they would catch rainwater to drink. In some extreme cases, there are stories that they had to do things that are too terrible to talk about just to stay alive. They were disconnected from the world, living in a permanent state of fear and hunger. But the tunnels were their world now, and they were determined to stay there. Some of them stayed for months, and others stayed for years. The crazy part is that the last organized group of holdouts did not come out until 1949. That is 4 years after the war was officially over. 2 men emerged from the tunnels on January 6, 1949, looking like they had seen another world. They were thin, their clothes were in rags, and they were blinking in the sunlight because they had not seen it in so long. When they were told the war had been over for years, they could hardly believe it. They had been living in the dark, waiting for a signal that never came. Researchers who went back into the tunnels found the places where these holdouts lived. They found small living areas with mats on the floor and piles of empty cans. They found personal items like combs, mirrors, and small statues. It was a heartbreaking look at how people survived in such a hopeless situation. The tunnels had become a prison and a sanctuary at the same time. These people were living in a time capsule, stuck in a war that the rest of the world had already forgotten. Even after those 2 men came out, there were rumors for years that more people were still down there. People talked about seeing lights in the distance at night or hearing strange noises coming from the ground. While most of these were probably just legends, it added to the mystery of the island. The tunnels had a way of playing tricks on your mind. When you are standing on that black sand and you know there are miles of hidden rooms beneath your feet, it is easy to imagine that you are not alone. The researchers also found that the tunnels held a lot of information that was never intended to be found. They found documents, maps, and diaries that gave a voice to the people who had lived in the dark. These items helped historians piece together the daily lives of the soldiers. They talked about the heat, the thirst, and the longing for home. It was a reminder that behind all the stone and fire there were real people with families and dreams. The tunnels were not just a fortress, they were a place of deep human suffering and endurance. Today, much of the tunnel network is still there, but it is slowly being reclaimed by the island. Some sections have collapsed and others have been filled with volcanic ash. The Japanese government treats the island as a sacred place, and it is mostly closed to the public. But the researchers who are allowed to go back find that the tunnels still have a powerful energy. It is a quiet, heavy feeling that stays with you. You realize that you are walking through a graveyard that is also a masterpiece of engineering. The story of the holdouts is one of the most incredible parts of the whole Iwo Jima saga. It shows just how effective those tunnels really were. They were built so well that they could hide people for years, even when thousands of others were looking for them. It is a mystery that still fascinates people today, and it makes you wonder if we have truly found everyone who was down there. The secrets of the past are deep, but some questions may never be answered. Terrifying lesson of the tunnels. So here's the deal. When we look back at the Iwo Jima tunnels, we are not just looking at a piece of military history. We are looking at what happens when human ingenuity meets absolute desperation. The researchers who went back inside proved that the stories we once laughed at were actually true. The island was a massive underground machine built for one purpose: to survive the impossible. But what does this really tell us about the world today? It shows us that even with all our planes, ships, and big bombs, a simple hole in the ground can still be one of the most powerful things in the world. What most people do not realize is that the tunnels of Iwo Jima changed the way we think about war forever. The huge cost of taking that island was one of the main reasons the decision was made to use much more powerful weapons later on. People realized that if every island was going to be an underground fortress, the cost in human lives would be too high to imagine. The tunnels were so effective that they actually helped change the course of history in a way that most people never think about. It is not that simple though, because the legacy of these tunnels is still seen in places all over the world today. The crazy part is that this kind of underground warfare did not stop at Iwo Jima. We saw it again in other parts of the world where smaller forces used tunnels to hold off much larger and more powerful armies. The lesson of the black sand is that the earth itself can be your greatest ally if you are willing to dig deep enough. It is a terrifying thought because it means that an enemy you cannot see is the hardest one to defeat. The researchers showed us that even 80 years later, we are still learning new things about how people can adapt to the worst conditions imaginable. Is it possible that there are still secrets buried under that volcanic ash that we will never find? Probably. The island is still shifting and the volcano is still breathing. New tunnels could be revealed by an earthquake, or old ones could be lost forever. The thing is, Iwo Jima will always be a place of mystery. It is a reminder that history is not just something you read about in a book, it is something that is still beneath our feet, waiting to be rediscovered. Every time someone goes back into those tunnels, they find a new piece of the puzzle that makes the story even more incredible. As we look at the photos of the rusted gear and the dark, narrow passages, we have to wonder about the people who were there. They spent months in the heat and the dark, building a world that nobody was ever supposed to see. They were part of a plan that was as brilliant as it was tragic. The tunnels are a monument to their will, but they are also a warning about the lengths people will go to when they are pushed to the edge. It is a story that stays with you long after you leave the island. The researchers have given us a glimpse into a world that was hidden for decades. They have shown us that the legends were real and that the fortress was even bigger than we thought. But as they pack up their gear and leave the island, the tunnels remain. They are still there in the dark, silent and waiting. They are a part of the island now as much as the volcano or the black sand, and they will always be a reminder of a time when the world was at war and the earth itself became a battlefield. Do you think we have finally discovered every secret hidden within the Iwo Jima tunnels, or is there something even bigger still waiting in the dark for the next team of researchers to find? If you found this dive into the underground fortress of Iwo Jima fascinating, make sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the world's greatest mysteries.